Dr. Stickvein had run 11,000 physicals in her career, and she had never once needed to recalibrate mid-scan. She needed to recalibrate now. The diagnostic array above the exam table blinked amber, then red, then a color the interface wasn't supposed to be able to produce, which the manual referred to only as sensor fault. Contact engineering. Stickvein stared at it for a long moment, her lower eyelids sliding sideways in the reflex her species used instead of blinking, and then she did what any reasonable physician would do. She ran the scan again. The patient on the table, a human female mid-30s, listed on the intake form as Priya Okonkwo-Reyes, former warehouse logistics coordinator, volunteer, non-combat support track, glanced up at the ceiling display without much interest. Something wrong? No, Stickvein said in the automatic tone doctors everywhere used to mean yes, something is extremely wrong. Just recalibrating. The station was 3 days into processing the first cohort of human volunteers accepted into the Coalition's provisional membership program, and so far the entire event had been almost aggressively boring. Humans arrived, filled out forms, answered questions about allergies with a level of vagueness that alarmed the intake clerks, and sat patiently while junior physicians like Stickvein ran them through the standard non-combat support physical. The same physical given to the Ket refugee crews. The same physical given to the Allen trade apprentices. A physical designed for species whose primary qualifications were caution, dexterity, and a willingness to follow instructions. Stickvein pressed her hand flat against the console, waited for the second scan to complete, and felt something in her chest go very still. The numbers hadn't changed. If anything, they'd gotten worse. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Bone density, 340% above the calibration baseline for a bipedal frame of this mass. Not armored bone. Not augmented bone. Ordinary calcium phosphate bone, laid down the slow biological way over decades by a body that apparently considered walk into things a design requirement rather than a failure mode. Grip strength. The scanner had asked the patient to squeeze a calibrated sensor rated for the upper range expected of a heavy labor Allen stevedore. The sensor had returned an error. Not a low reading. An error. The same kind you got when you asked a piece of equipment to measure something it hadn't been built to measure. Reflex latency. The system had clocked the patient's hand pulling back from a surprise heat stimulus in 0.09 seconds, which the diagnostic software flagged as implausible. Check probe calibration. Because the number on the screen belonged in the range reserved for combat-modified security personnel, not a woman who, according to her intake form, spent the last 6 years scanning barcodes. Old injury markers. This was the part that made Stickvein's hands unsteady on the console. The scan showed healed fractures in 4 places, a wrist, 2 ribs, a hairline crack along the left tibia. None of them recent, none of them treated with anything resembling proper alien standard bone setting technology. They had simply been allowed to knit back together, imperfectly, while the patient, presumably, kept using the limb. "Ma'am," Stickvein said carefully, "can you tell me about this fracture in your tibia?" Priya glanced down at her own shin as if it belonged to someone else. "Oh, that. Skiing. Bad landing. I was, 22? Walked on it for 2 days before I got it looked at, honestly. Bus schedule was a nightmare that week." "You walked on a fractured leg. It didn't feel broken. It felt sprained. Sprainedish." Stickvein looked at the screen, then at the calm woman on the table, then back at the screen, and did something she had not done since her residency exams. She called for a second opinion. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Senior physician, Drum arrived within 4 minutes, which meant he had been summoned by Stickvein's voice, not her formal request, which meant she had shouted his name into the comm rather than filing the proper consultation ticket. He would have been annoyed about the protocol violation if the first scan readout hadn't stopped him mid-stride in the doorway. "That's a hardware fault," he said. "The way people say things they don't believe in order to hear how they sound out loud. I ran it twice on 2 different units." Drum walked to the console, tapped through the readings himself, and Stickvein watched a senior physician with 30 years of xenomedical experience go very quiet. He looked at the patient. He looked back at the screen. "What are you made of?" he said. And it came out louder than he intended, more of a demand than a question, The kind of thing a person shouts when the alternative is standing there in silence, not understanding anything. Priya blinked at him. Cells? Same as everyone, I assume. Your skeletal density is, Drum stopped himself, visibly recalculating how to phrase a diagnosis he didn't have language for. It's comparable to load-bearing structural alloy. Your reflex speed is comparable to combat-grade neural augmentation. You have 4 significant historical fractures that were, by your own account, treated by waiting. I mean, yeah, that's kind of how bones work, isn't it? You wait and they fix themselves. Not like this. Not this fast. Not this completely. Drum turned to Thickvein. Pull 3 more volunteers. Different ages, different builds. I want to know if this is her or if this is all of them. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Drum didn't wait for the next scheduled appointment. He pulled the day's intake list, picked 3 names that had nothing in common with Priya's, different age bracket, different build, different stated reason for volunteering, and had all 3 brought into adjoining exam rooms, so the readings could be compared side by side instead of trusted to memory. The first was a 19-year-old named Callum Ibarra, thin as a doorframe, who had listed his prior occupation as student, part-time stockroom, and looked, if anything, faintly embarrassed to be examined at all, as though he suspected the whole apparatus of alien medicine was overkill for someone who mostly ate cereal and played strategy games. His bone density came back lower than Priya's, but still, Drum noted with a dry, private kind of despair, comfortably above anything the equipment's calibration range had been built to expect. His reflex latency was slower than hers by a margin that would have been reassuring if it hadn't still landed inside the band reserved for augmented security specialists. The second was a woman in her 60s named Grace Adeyemaholt, retired, silver-haired, who chatted amiably through the entire procedure about her garden and Astrom with real curiosity, whether alien soil needed the same kind of composting human soil did. Her scan showed a healed spinal compression fracture from a fall 9 years earlier, treated, by her own cheerful account, with some very good painkillers and my daughter's spare bedroom for 6 weeks, after which she had returned to hauling bags of mulch around her own back garden, without complaint. Her grip strength registered lower than the younger patient's, but her pain response threshold, the scanner's measure of how much tissue damage a patient could sustain before the nervous system began actively fighting the diagnostic probes, was, if anything, the highest of the 4. The third was a broad-shouldered man named Theo Falkenrath who had, in fact, been a soldier once years ago, and who Drum had half expected to be the outlier that explained everything, the single augmented data point skewing an otherwise normal sample. He wasn't. His numbers were higher than the others in a few categories and lower in others, scattered across the same impossible range, no more extraordinary within the human data set than any other name on the list. Whatever had produced these readings, it wasn't training, and it wasn't selection. It was baseline. Drum stood between the 4 open readouts for a long time, the way a person stands in a room after receiving news that hasn't finished landing yet and understood with the particular clarity that comes right before a decision gets made above your own authority level, that this was no longer a medical finding. It was a classification event, and classification events at the Coalition did not stay quiet, did not stay small, and did not, in his considerable experience, resolve themselves quickly. It was all of them. By the 4th human, a retired schoolteacher named Aldous Rees, who mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd had a hip replaced 11 years earlier and had gone back to gardening within 2 months, Drum had stopped being surprised and started being something closer to frightened in the careful, procedural way that trained professionals get frightened, which looks from the outside like extreme focus calm. He requested a room, not an exam room, a briefing room, the kind with a long table, and enough chairs for people whose titles required chairs. Within 6 hours, 11 specialists had reviewed the data on Priya Okonkwo-Reyes and 3 other human volunteers, and every one of them had, at some point during their individual review, said some version of the same sentence out loud, alone, to an empty room, before catching themselves and writing a formal note instead. What are you made of? Nobody had an answer yet. But the question had stopped being about biology within the first hour and started being about something much larger and much harder to put back in its box once it was out. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The Coalition for Interspecies Cooperation had existed for 412 standard years, built out of the wreckage of an era nobody liked to discuss in detail, a period 3 centuries prior, when a species called the Varen had been granted full membership on the strength of good manners and clever trade proposals, and had gone on 11 years later to attempt what the history archives dryly termed a unilateral resource acquisition event against 2 neighboring member worlds. The Varen were gone now, not defeated, gone in the specific sense that the Coalition's response to the event had been thorough enough that there was very little left to call a species anymore. The Varen file was thick and dry and deliberately unsensational. The Coalition's archivists had made a point, generations ago, of stripping the record of anything that read like a cautionary tale, on the theory that a story people found thrilling was a story people stopped taking seriously. What was left after the editing was worse than a story. It was a timeline. Provisional membership granted in year 1. Full citizenship in year 6, on the strength of trade agreements, so favorable to the rest of the Coalition that 3 separate committees had cited them as a model of good faith diplomacy. A single contested mining claim in year 15. A formal grievance in year 16. And then in year 17, an event that the file described, with the same flat administrative tone it used for everything else, as a unilateral resource acquisition action against 2 neighboring member worlds, a phrase that took up 1 line, and that stood in the archive for several 100,000 lives. Nobody in the Coalition's current membership had voted on the Varen's admission. Nobody currently serving had voted on the response either. That was, Stickvane's instructors had always stressed exactly the point. The people who made the mistake and the people who paid for it were rarely the same people, which meant the only honest way to prevent it from happening again was to build the caution permanently into the institution itself, rather than trust it to any one generation's good judgment. Every Coalition physician, on the first day of their xenomedical training, was shown the Varen file. Not to frighten them, the instructors always said, to remind them what a physical exam was actually for. A physical exam was not just about health. It was about classification. It told the Coalition what a species could do, so the Coalition could decide, with clear eyes, what a species should be allowed to do. And the data sitting in front of Director Mole Carson at 0400 station time, forwarded up through 4 levels of increasingly alarmed medical staff, said that the species currently filling out volunteer forms for cargo handling positions could, if they wanted to, tear the arms off a combat-rated security drone with their bare hands and be back at their desks in time for lunch. Carson read the file twice. Then she made a call that woke up 11 more people. The meeting the next morning was not supposed to include any human representatives. This was, on reflection, a mistake, and one that Carson would privately blame on the fact that nobody in the room had slept. 14 officials from 6 different divisions sat around the long table: medical, security, diplomatic relations, classification and registry. 2 representatives from what was officially called historical risk assessment and unofficially called the Varen office, and a very tired legal counsel who kept trying to remind everyone that provisional membership status came with specific procedural protections that could not simply be revoked because a physical exam had gone strangely. "I'm not proposing we revoke anything," said the security representative, a heavy-set Talic named Orsev, whose species had evolved from pack hunters, and who therefore had very particular instincts about which species deserve caution. "I'm proposing we don't finish processing 3,000 more of these people into one-armed support roles until we understand what we're looking at." "They volunteered for cargo work," Drum said. He'd been invited to present the medical data and had stayed uninvited because he wanted to see how this went. Nobody asked to be a soldier. They filled out forms for a job moving boxes. A species that can, apparently, casually survive injuries that would kill most of us, and whose baseline reflexes exceed our combat modification standards, filled out forms for a job moving boxes, Orsa said. "Doesn't that strike anyone else as worth examining?" "It strikes me as evidence they're not aggressive," said the diplomatic representative, a slim, quiet Vernai named Tavash EHL, who had spent the last 2 years managing the human first contact file and had grown, in that time, genuinely fond of the species in question, in the specific tired way you grow fond of a large dog that keeps bringing you dead animals as gifts. If they had this capability and wanted to use it, don't you think we'd have noticed by now? They've had access to our ships, our stations, our unguarded medical bays for 2 years. Nobody's been hurt. Nobody's been threatened. They ask a lot of questions about snack machines. That's not reassuring, Orsa said. That's exactly what worries me. A species with this capability, presenting as harmless, cooperative. Even, the word your own reports use is endearing. That is not a coincidence, EHL. That is a pattern. Every predator species in the historical record that succeeded at large-scale conflict did so by first appearing unthreatening. The room went quiet because everyone in it, whether they wanted to or not, was thinking about the Varan file. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It was the Historical Risk Assessment Office that raised the option nobody wanted to say out loud first, though everyone had been circling it for an hour. Containment. Not violence. The coalition had learned at terrible cost that violence against a species that size, spread across that many undefended civilian positions, was its own catastrophe. Containment meant something quieter. Restriction of movement. Suspension of the provisional membership process. A formal reclassification from candidate species to monitored species, which came with travel limits, technology embargoes, and this was the part that made even the tired legal counsel sit up straight. Permanent denial of full coalition citizenship. We've done this before, said the risk assessment officer, a narrow, precise being named Kalafarash, laying out 3 prior case files on the table's shared display. 3 species in the last 200 years scored anomalously high on baseline physical capability during intake screening. All 3 were reclassified as monitored rather than granted full membership. All 3 are, as of this year, still stable, still cooperative, still, by every measure we track, content with their status. He pulled the nearest of the 3 files forward and let it stand in for the pattern. The Bricassi. Discovered 91 years ago, physical capability roughly 4 times baseline for their body class. Behavioral profile cooperative. No aggression indicators across initial screening. Much like what we're seeing now. Classified as monitored rather than full members. 91 years later, they hold stable trade agreements, staff diplomatic posts, and not one confirmed act of large-scale violence against a coalition member. By any external measure, a success. Ask them how it feels, EHL said. Ask a Bricassi delegate what it's like to know that no matter how many generations of good behavior pass, their grandchildren will still be born pre-flagged. I've met one. She used the word provisional to describe her own life expectancy in this coalition, not her citizenship status. 91 years of perfect behavior, and the file still opens with the word monitored, before it says anything else about who they are. Define content, EHL said quietly. Farash didn't answer that directly. The alternative is the Varan outcome. I'm not saying humans will do what the Varan did. I'm saying we don't know that they won't. And the entire purpose of this process is to make that determination before it costs anyone their life, not after. Carson, who had said very little during the meeting, finally spoke. By the time the meeting reached its second hour, the problem had stopped being contained to the briefing room, which was, in its own way, exactly the kind of complication Carson had been dreading since the first escalation call woke her up. A junior records clerk, not read into the classification review, had noticed an unusual spike in cross-divisional data requests tagged to the human intake program and, assuming it was newsworthy rather than sensitive, had mentioned it to a colleague, who mentioned it to a friend working station communications, who filed a routine curiosity query that happened to land, 40 minutes later, on the desk of an independent Alan news feed known for publishing first and confirming later. The story that went out was thin on facts and heavy on the 2 words guaranteed to spread fastest through any station population. Reclassification review. It didn't name humans specifically, the leak hadn't gotten that far, but station gossip filled in the gap within the hour, and by the time Carson's aide slid a summary of public sentiment across the table, the mood among the several hundred non-human residents sharing docking bays, mess halls, and maintenance corridors with human volunteers had shifted from mild curiosity to something closer to nervous vigilance. 2 separate incident reports came in before lunch. Nothing violent, nothing even confrontational. Just Alan dock workers giving a wider berth than usual to a human cargo team unloading a routine shipment. and italic security officer requesting, with visible discomfort, to be reassigned off a corridor patrol that put him alone with human residents for extended stretches. This is why speed matters, Carson said, reading the summary twice before setting it down. Whatever we decide in this room, we decide it today, and we decide it clearly, because uncertainty is worse than either answer. A monitored species knows where it stands. A species waiting to find out whether it's about to be monitored does not, and neither does everyone living next to them. Bring in a human representative. That's not standard procedure for a classification review, Farash said. No, Carson agreed. But I like to ask them the question directly, rather than deciding their species' entire future based on a room full of people who have never had the conversation. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Priya Okonkwo had been asked to wait in a side room for what she'd assumed was some kind of follow-up on the blood work, and had spent the last 90 minutes eating vending machine crackers and reading a paperback novel she'd brought from home, on the theory that any bureaucracy, alien or otherwise, involved a great deal of waiting. When a very tired-looking Vernai official knocked and asked her to come with him to a briefing room, she closed the book on her thumb, stood up, and said, "Is this about the leg thing?" Because that really was just skiing. She was not told anything more useful than, "Please wait here for the better part of an hour," which gave her time to do the thing she always did when a situation felt bigger than the information she'd been given. She called her sister back home, 3 time zones and 1 small miracle of relay satellites away, and got her voicemail, because it was the middle of the night on Earth and normal people were asleep. "Hey, it's me," she said to the recording, keeping her voice light out of habit rather than confidence. "Weird day. They pulled me into some kind of meeting after my checkup, a bunch of very serious-looking people from what I think are like 6 different alien government departments, and nobody's told me what it's actually about, which either means it's nothing, or it's the kind of something where they don't want to say the word something out loud until they've decided how bad it is." She paused, turning the paperback over in her free hand without opening it. "I'm probably overthinking it. Probably just paperwork. I'll call you properly once I know what's going on. Tell Mom I'm fine. Actually don't. Don't tell her anything. She'll spiral. Love you. Bye." She ended the call, sat with the silence of the little side room for a moment, and thought, not for the first time since leaving Earth, that the strangest part of all of this wasn't the aliens, or the ships, or the food that never quite tasted like what the label promised. It was how much of it still came down to the same small, ordinary feeling she'd had 100 times back home, sitting outside a manager's office, waiting to find out whether the news was good. The particular, universal dread of being a person whose future was currently being decided by other people in a room she hadn't been invited into yet. When the tired Vernai official finally knocked, she closed the book on her thumb, the way she had 100 times that morning already, and told herself, mostly successfully, that whatever this was, she'd handle it the way she handled everything, by showing up, telling the truth, and not making it more dramatic than it had to be. She was not, in fact, told what it was about until she was seated at the long table, facing 14 officials from 6 divisions, most of whom she had never seen a member of their species before in her life, all of whom were looking at her with an expression she associated, from her years managing a warehouse floor, with people trying to figure out how to fire someone without a lawsuit. Carson explained the situation plainly. The scan results, the historical precedent, the 2 paths under discussion, continued integration on the current track or reclassification to monitored status, with the honesty to say what that would mean for humanity's long-term standing in the coalition. Priya listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which several people in the room found more unnerving than if she'd argued. When Carson finished, Priya was quiet for a moment, turning a cracker wrapper over in her hands. "Can I ask a question first?" "Of course. Do you think I'm dangerous?" "Right now, looking at me." Carson considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think you have the physical capacity to be extremely dangerous, and I have no data telling me whether you have any intention of being so." "That's fair," Priya said. "That's honestly a completely fair answer, and I appreciate you not dressing it up." She set the wrapper down. "Can I try to explain something? I'm not a scientist. I stack pallets for a living, or I did, before I filled out a form, because it sounded interesting. So I'm going to explain this the way I'd explain it to my nephew." Nobody stopped her. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Humans didn't get like this because we're predators looking for prey, Priya said. We got like this because for most of our history, everything wanted to eat us, and the ground itself was actively trying to kill us, and there weren't any doctors or hospitals or bone-setting machines for basically the entire time our bodies were figuring out how to be built. If you broke your leg 40,000 years ago, and it didn't heal wrong but functional, you died. So the ones who healed wrong but functional had kids, and their kids inherited the same trick over and over for a very, very long time. She looked around the table. The reflexes, same thing. If you were slow, something ate you before you had kids. If you were fast, you gotta have kids, and your kids gotta be fast too. We didn't design ourselves to survive combat with alien security drones. We got built the slow, ugly, accidental way by several 100,000 years of almost everything trying to kill us, and mostly failing. That doesn't make the capability less real, Orsa said, not unkindly, but firmly. No, Priya agreed. It doesn't. I'm not saying don't worry about the capability. I'm saying ask a different question than what can they do. Ask what we've actually done with it. You said it yourself. She looked at Carson. 2 years. Full run of your stations, your ships, your unguarded medical bays, like the diplomat said. How many fights have we started? None, EHL said quietly. How many times has a human hurt someone here, on purpose? None on record, Farash admitted, though it clearly cost him something to say it. Right, because most of us go our whole lives never once needing to use any of this. Priya spread her hands. I broke my leg skiing and walked to a bus stop because I didn't want to bother anyone with an ambulance bill. That's the most dramatic story about my own toughness I've got. And it's not even a good one. I'm not a soldier. I'm not secretly a weapon. I'm a woman who used to stack boxes and now wants to see what's out past the asteroid belt. The scary numbers on your screen are just what happens when you take a species that evolved to survive absolutely everything, and you ask them to fill out a volunteer form instead. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. There was a long silence after that. Farash broke it first, and not gently. With respect, that is exactly the argument every dangerous species in the historical record has made about itself. Nobody believes they're the threat. That's not a defense, Ms. Alcon-Correz. That's the precondition for every disaster in this office's files. I know, Priya said, and something in her voice shifted. Not defensive, just tired. The specific tiredness of someone who has had to explain the same difficult thing more than once in her life. I'm not going to sit here and prove a negative to you. I can't prove we'll never do something terrible, because nobody can prove that about anybody, including your own people, I'd bet. What I can tell you is what we actually build when we're not surviving something. We don't mostly build weapons. We build hospitals for the people who can't heal like I did. We build laws so the strong ones can't just take what they want from the weak ones. We spend an enormous amount of energy, honestly, trying to talk each other out of using exactly the kind of strength you're worried about. That's not proof. It's the actual record if you want to look at it instead of the scan. Carson glanced at EHL. Is that accurate? The diplomatic file. It's more than accurate, EHL said. It's the single most consistent thing in 2 years of contact reports. They apologize for things that aren't their fault. They form work groups to help colleagues they've known for 6 weeks. The security incidents in our files aren't humans hurting anyone. They're humans getting hurt trying to help someone else, and not mentioning it until someone notices they're limping. Drum, who had been silent since presenting his data, spoke up from the back of the room. That fracture in her tibia. She didn't seek treatment for 2 days. I asked her why, expecting some medical reason. She said, and I quote from my own notes, didn't want to bother anyone. Director, I've treated 400 species. I have never once logged that as a reason for delaying care. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Farash was not finished, and to his credit, he said the hardest part of his argument plainly rather than letting it sit unspoken. I'm not arguing that this species is malicious. I'm arguing that intention isn't the only variable that matters. The Varen weren't malicious when we first classified them either. They were ambitious and confident, and they had capability that outran their institution's ability to restrain their worst individuals. That is the actual pattern in every historical case. Director, not evil species, just capable species whose social structures hadn't caught up to what a handful of their people could do if they decided to. He turned back to Priya. You keep telling us what most of you would never do. I'm asking about the ones who would. Every species has some. What happens when one of yours, with your reflexes and your bone density, decides the rules don't apply to him? Priya didn't answer immediately, and for the first time since sitting down, she looked genuinely uncertain, not about the facts, but about how honest to be. Then somebody gets hurt, she said finally. That happens. It's happened back home, more times than I like to think about. One person deciding the rules don't apply to them, and other people paying for it. I'm not going to stand here and tell you humans have that solved, because we don't. Nobody does. But I'll tell you the thing that actually stops it most of the time, and it isn't a law, and it isn't a wall, and it isn't a scam like the one that started all this. It's the rest of us. Because the numbers on your screen, the bone density, and the grip strength, that's not just one guy. That's basically everybody. So when one person decides to be that guy, he's not the strongest thing in the room anymore. He's just the strongest thing in a room full of people just as strong as him, who've decided mostly not to be that guy. That's what actually keeps us from being the Varen. Not that we're weaker. That there's a lot of us, and most of us made a different choice, and ones who don't get stopped by the rest of us before they get very far. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Orsev, the security representative, was the one who finally broke the silence, and what he said surprised everyone at the table, including himself. That's the same principle our pack structures ran on before we built any of this. He gestured vaguely at the room, the station, the whole apparatus of the coalition. Strength wasn't dangerous because one individual had it. It was dangerous when the group had no mechanism to check it. We didn't survive our own predators by being weak. We survived by being strong together, with rules about how the strength got used. He looked at Farash. I came into this meeting ready to vote for monitored status. I'm less sure now. Not because the risk went away. Because I'm no longer certain the risk looks like what we filed it as. Farash didn't concede outright. It wasn't in his nature. And his job existed specifically to hold the line other people were tempted to abandon in the room. But he did something that, from him, counted as significant. He asked a question instead of restating his position. If we grant full integration, he said to Priya, and something does go wrong, one of yours, using exactly the capability we've been discussing against a coalition member, what happens? Not what you hope happens. What actually happens, based on what you know about your own people. Priya thought about it honestly, which was, Carson noted, exactly the right answer to a question like that. Depends who's closest. But if I had to bet, somebody else steps in front of it. Probably gets hurt doing it. Doesn't think twice. She paused. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I'm just saying what you want to hear. I'm not. I'm telling you what I watched happen 3 separate times in my own life. None of them dramatic. None of them made the news. Somebody bigger than the situation stepping into it anyway, because somebody else needed them to. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Carson let the room sit with that for almost a full minute before she spoke again. And when she did, it wasn't to announce a decision. It was to ask, gently, the question that had been underneath the entire meeting from the start. Ms. Okonkwo-Reyes, you came here to move cargo. You're sitting in a room deciding the classification status of your entire species. I want to ask you something the scan can't answer, and neither can the historical file. She leaned forward slightly. What do you actually want? Not what you think will keep us calm. What do you want out past the asteroid belt? Priya was quiet for a second, and when she answered, there wasn't any performance left in it, just a tired woman, a long way from a warehouse floor, telling the truth because the question had finally been asked plainly enough to deserve one. I want to see it, she said. All of it. I spent 34 years on one planet doing a job that mattered to approximately nobody outside my own department. And then one day somebody told me there were other people, whole other worlds full of them. And I could go look. That's it. That's the whole ambition. I don't want your resources. I don't want to run anything. I filled out a form for cargo work because I figured that was a real job that needed doing. And it'd get me a window seat on a ship going somewhere I'd never been. If that's not enough of an answer for a species-wide classification, I understand. But it's the true one. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The room deliberated for another 40 minutes after Priya was escorted back to the side room, and the vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous. Farash abstained rather than vote in favor, which the meeting record would note as a formal reservation rather than an objection, a distinction that mattered enormously in coalition procedure and meant, in practice, that the Historical Risk Assessment Office would be watching, quietly and permanently, in the specific way that office watched. Everything, for the rest of however long humanity, remained a member species. But the vote went in favor. Continued integration, current track, no reclassification. With one addition that Carson insisted on and nobody argued against. The standard non-combat support physical would be retired for human applicants, effective immediately, and replaced with a new baseline exam built specifically around what an actual human body could do, not to restrict them. Carson was careful to specify, in the order, but so that the next junior physician who ran a routine scan wouldn't have to stand alone in an exam room at 2 a.m, shouting a question at the ceiling because nobody had thought to write down the answer first. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The public correction went out within the hour, over Carson's own signature rather than a spokesperson's, which was, station veterans noted, not standard practice, and therefore meant something. Continued integration, current track, no change in status, full stop. It didn't stop every wary glance in every corridor overnight. Trust, EHL told Priya afterward, was not the kind of thing a single announcement could put back once it had started a fray. But the Island dock workers were back to their usual brisk indifference within a week, and the Taluk officer who'd asked for reassignment quietly withdrew the request 3 days later, after he admitted to a colleague, watching a human maintenance apprentice spend an unpaid lunch break helping an elderly Ket resident who dropped an entire crate of fragile trade goods in a crowded corridor, gathering the pieces without being asked and without, as far as anyone could tell, expecting anything in return. Carson found Farash alone in the briefing room an hour after the vote, still reviewing the case files he'd laid out that morning, as though rereading them might change the count. You could have voted against, she said. Abstention isn't a hiding place, Kalu. Everyone in that room knew what it meant. I know exactly what it meant. Farash didn't look up from the display. It meant I still think we took a risk today that we won't fully understand for another 15 years, the same way nobody understood the Varen risk until year 17. I wasn't willing to put my name on no, when every piece of behavioral evidence in front of me said the opposite of what the biology said. But I wasn't willing to call it settled, either. That's not a criticism. That's the job. Carson sat down across from him. I don't think you're wrong to watch them, Kalu. I think you'd be failing at your post if you didn't. I just think the woman was right about one thing, whether or not it was the thing she meant to say. Which thing? That the safest species in the historical record was never the weakest one. It was the one that built the most reasons for itself not to use what it had. We can't manufacture that for them. We can only watch and hope the reasons they've already built hold. She stood. Keep watching. That's still your job tomorrow. It's just not the only job in this building anymore. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Farish's office did not stop watching, and to its credit, it never pretended otherwise. A standing file was opened under the designation Human Behavioral Baseline, quietly cross-referenced against every incident report, medical record, and disciplinary action involving a human volunteer anywhere in coalition space. Updated weekly. Reviewed monthly by Farash himself. He did not enjoy the work. He had hoped, in the private way a careful person hopes without ever quite admitting it out loud, that the file would stay thin. It mostly did. In the first month, it logged one confrontation, a heated argument in a mess hall over a card game, resolved before security arrived, notable mainly because both humans involved had apologized to each other, and separately to the Allen staff who'd had to clean up a spilled tray within the hour. It logged a maintenance apprentice who'd caught a falling support strut with his bare hands during a docking bay malfunction, preventing what the safety report dryly termed significant structural and personnel risk, and who had, according to 3 separate witnesses, immediately asked if anyone else was hurt before mentioning that his own hand was bleeding. It logged in the third week, a human medical volunteer donating blood, tissue compatible in an emergency, to a cat patient she had known for exactly 11 days. Because the patient's own species supply hadn't arrived in time, and hers, against every reasonable expectation, turned out to be close enough to work. None of it proved anything. Farash reminded himself every time he closed the file for the month. A pattern wasn't a guarantee. 91 years of good behavior from the Bracassi hadn't erased the word monitored from a single one of their files. And he wasn't about to declare humanity settled after 6 weeks of decent ones. But he found himself against his own professional instincts, no longer dreading the monthly review the way he had the first time. He found himself, if he was honest with the notes he kept for no one but himself, almost looking forward to being wrong. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 6 weeks later, Stickvane was running physicals again. The new baseline exam this time calibrated properly. No more red flag errors. No more recalibrating mid-scan. She'd requested the human intake shift specifically. Drum had asked her why, expecting some professional reason, a research interest, a career move. Because the first day was the most interesting day of my career, she told him. And I want to know what the next interesting thing is going to be. Her afternoon patient was a 19-year-old human named Marcus, freshly volunteered, filling out the same forms Priya had filled out 6 weeks earlier, for a maintenance apprenticeship on a cargo hauler headed toward the outer stations. The scan ran clean this time, flagged nothing the equipment didn't already expect, because the equipment had finally been told what to expect. So, Marcus said, swinging his legs off the exam table when the scan finished, how'd I do? Stickvane looked at the readout, the bone density, the reflex speed, the healed hairline fracture in his left hand from what the intake notes described only as a door, don't ask, and felt, for the second time in 6 weeks, the particular vertigo of looking at ordinary numbers that used to be extraordinary and understanding, this time, exactly what she was looking at. You're healthy, she said. You're cleared for the apprenticeship. That's it? No shouting this time. Stickvane's eyelids slid sideways, which in her species was the closest thing to a smile. Not today, but ask me again after your first hard landing. Marcus grinned, hopped off the table, and headed for the door, already talking about the ship's mess hall and whether it had anything resembling actual food. And Stickvane watched him go. Ordinary, unremarkable, built the slow, accidental way out of several 100,000 years of almost everything trying to kill him and mostly failing. And thought that whatever the coalition ended up doing with a species like this, it was, at the very least, never going to be boring. She filed the report, marked the case closed, and called in the next patient. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 3 months after the hearing, Priya Alconquerez stood at an observation window on a cargo hauler called the Long Reasonable Distance, watching the asteroid belt slide past in a slow field of tumbling gray rock, and thought that whoever had named the ship had clearly never actually flown through anything, because there was nothing reasonable about it. It was enormous and cold, and lit from somewhere behind her by a star that wasn't the sun, and it was, without any competition at all, the single most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life. Her cargo shift didn't start for another 40 minutes. She'd learned over the last 3 months exactly how long she could linger at this particular window before the shift supervisor, a patient perpetually amused Allah named Vess, started making pointed comments about volunteers who signed up for logistics work and then spent their break time doing astronomy instead. Vess never actually made her leave early. He just liked to remind her that he'd noticed. She thought about the hearing sometimes, out here, in the specific, unhurried way a person thinks about a thing that turned out fine, but could easily not have. She still didn't know, in any technical sense, what had actually been decided in the parts of that meeting she wasn't in the room for, or what Farish's continued watching looked like day to day, or whether some quiet flag sat on her file, and every other human file, permanently now, the administrative equivalent of a held breath. EHL had told her, gently, over a cup of something that was marketed as coffee and wasn't, that some of that watching would probably never fully stop, not in her lifetime, maybe not in her grandchildren's. She decided she could live with that. Being watched carefully wasn't the same as being unwelcome. It was just what it cost, apparently, to be the kind of thing a room full of careful people had to take seriously. What she thought about more, standing at the window, was the question itself. The one Drum had shouted at her in that first exam room. The one that had somehow ended up deciding the shape of an entire species' future in the space of one very long afternoon. What are you made of? She still didn't have a better answer than the one she'd given the committee 6 weeks and 1 lifetime ago. Bone and stubbornness and a body built by several 100,000 years of nearly dying and not quite managing it. But standing here, with a belt of ancient rock sliding past a window that shouldn't have existed, on a ship crewed by 4 species she couldn't have named a year ago, doing a job that mattered to exactly the people it was supposed to matter to, she thought maybe that wasn't the whole answer after all. Maybe the rest of it was simpler than bone density and harder to put on a scan. She'd wanted to see it, all of it. And here she was, seeing it, one asteroid field and one thoroughly mediocre cup of not coffee at a time. Ordinary, unremarkable. Exactly as dangerous as she'd always been and exactly as unlikely to prove it. Doing precisely what she'd told the committee she wanted, which had turned out against every historical precedent in Kala Farish's careful files to be true. Behind her, a com chimed twice, the signal for shift change. Priya took one last look at the belt, gray and enormous and indifferent, and went to go move some boxes.